The cicadas were screaming into the void of the August night, their cries a constant, high-pitched thrum against the oppressive heat. Sleep was an impossible dream, a distant shore I couldn't reach. The sheets on my bed were damp, twisted around my legs like vines. I finally gave up, pushing myself free and walking to the window, hoping for a breeze that I knew wouldn't come. My room on the second floor overlooked our perfectly manicured back lawn, and beyond it, the equally perfect lawn of Mr. Thorne. His house was usually dark by this hour, a quiet shadow against the moon-bleached sky, but tonight, a single light burned in his living room. It was a soft, warm square of gold, and it drew my tired eyes like a moth to a flame. At first, I saw only movement, a fluid dance of shadows against the drawn curtains, but my eyes adjusted to the dimness, and the shadows took form. Two people, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, and a woman, slender and graceful, her pale hair catching the lamplight like a halo. It was the hair I recognized first. That specific shade of platinum blonde, the kind that looked like spun moonlight. Amelia, my stepmother. My heart seized in my chest, a cold, hard knot of disbelief. They weren't just talking. His hands were in her hair, tangled in those perfect strands, and her body was pressed against his, arching in a way I had never seen, a gesture of pure, desperate surrender. It was him, Mr. Thorne, the quiet neighbor with the kind eyes and the calloused hands. I stood frozen, a statue carved from shame and shock, my breath trapped in my lungs. The window pane felt like a sheet of ice against my forehead. I couldn't look away. It was a violation, a sacred boundary being crossed right before my eyes, and yet I was rooted to the spot. I watched them move together, a frantic, silent ballet of forbidden passion. It was in the way his head dipped to her neck, the way her fingers clawed at his back, the sheer, undeniable hunger in their embrace. And then, as if she could feel my gaze burning through the glass, through the darkness that separated our two perfect houses, Amelia's head fell back. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of agonizing pleasure, but then they slowly opened. Her gaze drifted, unfocused at first, across the dark expanse of the lawn, and then she saw me. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the dim light, locked directly onto mine. The pleasure vanished, replaced by a sudden, stark terror. She knew. In that silent, shattering moment, she knew that I had seen everything, and the world as I knew it simply ceased to exist. Before that night, before the shattered reflection in the window pane, the summer had begun with the illusion of peace. I came home from my first year of college to the familiar scent of lemon polish and cut grass, to the grand, silent welcome of our house. It was a beautiful place, a sprawling colonial testament to my father's success, with rooms that seemed to hold their breath, waiting for a life that never quite filled them. My father, David, had picked me up from the station, his conversation a familiar mix of pride in my grades and a distracted monologue about a new architectural bid in Boston. He was a good man, my father, but his love was expressed in square footage and stock portfolios, a language of provision rather than presence. He built worlds for strangers, but often seemed like a visitor in his own. And then there was Amelia. She greeted me at the door, her smile as bright and carefully arranged as the peonies in the porcelain vase on the foyer table. She was, as always, flawless. Her platinum hair was swept into an elegant knot at the nape of her neck, her simple white dress accentuating the slender frame she maintained, with a discipline left over from another life. She hugged me, and for a moment I smelled her perfume, something light and floral, like jasmine on a summer night, a scent too delicate for the heavy, opulent air of our home. That first dinner back set the tone for the weeks to come. Amelia had prepared an elaborate meal, the kind of food you see in magazines, each plate a miniature work of art. She tried to draw me out, asking about my classes, my friends, her blue eyes fixed on me with a determined warmth. But the performance was fractured by my father's cell phone, which lay on the polished mahogany table like a black, pulsating heart. It buzzed halfway through her question about my art history professor. David picked it up without apology, his voice instantly shifting from the soft tones of a family man to the sharp, decisive cadence of a businessman closing a deal. "Move the steel shipment up to Tuesday," he commanded, turning his body away from the table, already a world away from us. Amelia's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack in her perfect facade before she composed herself again. She picked at her salmon, the silence at our end of the table growing wider and deeper, a canyon carved by my father's booming voice, discussing logistics and deadlines. In that moment, I wasn't just seeing my stepmom. I was seeing a profoundly lonely woman, trapped in a gilded cage she had helped build. I started watching her, truly watching her, in a way I never had before. As a boy, she had just been Dad's new wife, a kind, beautiful woman who tried her best to fill the void my mother had left. But coming home now, at 19, I saw her through a different lens. I saw the woman, not just the role she played. I noticed the delicate line of her collarbone when she wore a summer blouse, the way she moved with an innate, fluid grace, a ghost of the ballerina she once was. She had been a rising star in a New York City dance company when she met my father. He had been her patron, her admirer, and then her husband. She had traded the stage lights for the soft, recessed lighting of our suburban palace, and I began to wonder, for the first time, if she ever mourned the exchange. Her beauty was a quiet, almost tragic thing. Her skin was like porcelain, so pale you could almost see the fine blue veins at her temples. Her hands were long and expressive, but they were often restless, twisting a ring on her finger or smoothing down an invisible crease in the tablecloth. Her loneliness was a physical presence. I'd find her in the garden most afternoons, tending to her roses with a fierce, singular focus. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and long gloves, snipping away dead leaves and thorns with a precision that was both admirable and sad. It was as if the flowers were her confidants, the only things she could nurture that would bloom in return without complication or demand. Sometimes I'd see her pause, shears in hand, and just stare into the distance, her gaze lost somewhere over the immaculate green lawns of our neighborhood. The bright, social smile was gone, and in its place was a look of such profound melancholy that I felt an ache in my own chest. On other evenings, after my father had retreated to his study with a brandy and a stack of blueprints, she would sit in the living room, a single lamp casting a warm glow on her, a glass of white wine untouched on the table beside her. She wouldn't read or watch television. She would just sit, still as a statue, surrounded by beautiful, expensive things, looking like the most desolate person in the world. It was a silence filled with unspoken words, with the ghosts of pirouettes and applause, a silence that was growing louder and more desperate with each passing day of the long, hot summer. The perfect picture of our family was beginning to fray at the edges, and I was the only one close enough to see the threads coming undone. The house next door had been a silent companion to our own for the better part of a year, its windows dark and vacant, its garden slowly surrendering to the patient creep of weeds. It was a mirror of our own grand colonial, but an empty one, a hollow space that only amplified the quiet in our own home. Its sale was the subject of brief, uninspired speculation at neighborhood gatherings. A banker, perhaps, or a surgeon for the nearby hospital. Someone who would fit the mold, who would hire the right landscaping service and ensure their recycling bins were never overflowing. Then, one Tuesday morning, an old, slightly rusted Ford pickup truck pulled into the driveway, groaning under the weight of furniture that was more worn and loved than bought and curated. There was no professional moving company, no team of uniformed men. There was just him. From my bedroom window, I watched him work all day under the relentless July sun. He was a man who seemed to be carved from a different type of wood than the men in our neighborhood. He wore a simple gray t-shirt that was soon dark with sweat and a pair of faded jeans that had seen years of labor. He moved with an unhurried, powerful efficiency, lifting heavy oak desks and worn leather armchairs as if they were nothing. He was alone, and he seemed to prefer it that way, pausing only to wipe his brow with the back of a dusty forearm or to drink water straight from a gallon jug. His name, we learned from the mailbox that was delivered a few days later, was Marcus Thorne. He was not a banker or a surgeon. As the days turned into a week, his routine became a quiet counterpoint to ours. While my father's car whispered out of the driveway at dawn and returned long after dusk, Marcus's old truck often stayed put. I'd see him in the yard, not directing a team of gardeners, but on his hands and knees, pulling up the stubborn weeds himself, his knuckles caked with dirt. He was rebuilding the crumbling stone wall that separated our properties, his movements measured and patient, the solid thunk of stone on stone, a strangely comforting sound in the afternoon stillness. In the evenings, he didn't disappear into a brightly lit interior to watch a large-screen television. He would sit on his front porch, a weathered notebook resting on his knee, and simply watch the sky bleed from orange to purple. Sometimes he wrote, his pen scratching across the page. Other times he just sat, a solitary figure in the twilight, and there was a stillness about him, a self-contained quality that I found both intimidating and deeply intriguing. He was a mystery, a disruption to the neighborhood's polished veneer, and his presence made our own home feel even more like a sterile, air-conditioned showroom. The first time he crossed the invisible line onto our property, it felt like a significant event. It was a Saturday. My father was, predictably, at the office, and I was in the living room, trying to get through a dense history textbook. I heard the doorbell, a sound so infrequent it made me jolt. Amelia, who had been arranging a new bouquet of lilies on the mantelpiece, looked momentarily startled. She smoothed the front of her linen dress, a nervous, reflexive gesture, and went to the door. It was him. Standing on our perfectly swept porch, Marcus Thorne looked larger, more real, than he did from my window. He was holding a broken pair of long-handled pruning shears. "Hi," he said, and his voice was deeper than I expected, with a slight gravelly texture to it. "Sorry to bother you. I'm Marcus Thorne from next door." He offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "I seem to have broken these on that monster of a wisteria I inherited. I was wondering if I might be able to borrow a pair of yours, just for an hour or so." Amelia was flustered, but in a way I hadn't seen before. It wasn't the polite, distant charm she used with my father's business associates. It was a genuine, almost girlish shyness. "Oh, of course," she said, her own voice a little breathless. "Not a bother at all. Please, wait here." As she hurried towards the garage, Marcus's eyes drifted past the open door, and for a brief moment, they met mine. He didn't offer a wide, artificial smile. He just gave a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement. His gaze was steady and unnervingly perceptive, as if in that one glance he saw past the expensive furniture and the quiet teenager with a book and understood the fundamental emptiness of the room. Amelia returned, holding out our own shears, the green handles bright and new-looking against his worn, calloused hands. "Here you are," she said. Their fingers brushed as he took them from her. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact, but the air in the foyer suddenly felt thick, charged with an unspoken energy. "Thank you," he said, his eyes not on the tool, but on her face. "I really appreciate it, Amelia." He had read her name on the mailbox, of course, but the way he said it sounded personal, familiar. She blushed, a faint pink that rose from her neck to her cheeks, and it was the most honest and vulnerable expression I had seen on her face all summer. "You're welcome, Marcus." The silence that followed lasted only a second or two, but it stretched, taut and shimmering with a strange new awareness. Then he smiled again, turned, and walked away. Amelia closed the door slowly and stood with her back to me for a long time, her hand resting on the doorknob. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She was just breathing. And I knew, with a certainty that made a cold dread pool in my stomach, that something had just begun. A man with dirt under his fingernails and stories in his eyes had just walked onto our perfect lawn, and he had, in the space of a single, polite question, exposed all the cracks in our beautiful, hollow home. That single, brief encounter on our front porch changed the geography of our summer. Before, the property line was just a manicured edge of grass meeting a crumbling stone wall. Now it was a frontier, a space charged with potential. The silence that had separated the two houses was replaced by a quiet, vibrating hum of awareness. It began with small gestures. A wave from Amelia as she watered her hydrangeas. A nod from Marcus as he carried lumber to his back porch. These were innocent, neighborly acknowledgments, the kind of thing no one would notice, but I noticed. I saw the way Amelia's hand would pause, midair, for a second longer than necessary. I saw the way Marcus's work would slow, his focus shifting from his task to the solitary, graceful figure moving through the garden next door. He returned the pruning shears the next day, washed and oiled, leaving them on our porch with a simple, handwritten note that said, "Thank you, Em." Amelia found it, and I saw her fold the small piece of paper carefully and slip it into the pocket of her apron, a secret treasure. Predictably, her garden became her sanctuary more than ever before. She spent hours out there, her wide-brimmed hat a constant fixture among the roses and lavender. But I noted she spent most of her time now working on the flower beds that ran parallel to the low stone wall, the very wall that Marcus was patiently rebuilding. It was there that the whispers began. At first, their conversations were brief, carried on the warm afternoon air across the 10 or so feet that separated them. They spoke of the soil, of the fight against Japanese beetles, of the unforgiving summer sun. The topics were mundane, but their tone was not. There was a gentle curiosity, a shared language of people who found solace in the earth. I would sit in the kitchen, pretending to read, the window open just enough to catch fragments of their dialogue. I was becoming an unwilling eavesdropper, a spy in my own home. One afternoon, the conversation shifted. I was watching from my bedroom window as Marcus set a heavy gray stone into place on the wall. Amelia was pruning a climbing rose nearby. "You move like a dancer," he said, his voice casual, yet his words landed with the precision of a carefully aimed arrow. "Even when you're just pulling weeds." Amelia froze, her gloved hands still. No one ever mentioned her dancing. In our house, her past was like a beautiful, antique piece of furniture, admired but never used, a relic from another life. My father would boast about it to his colleagues. My wife used to be with the New York City Ballet, but he never spoke to her about it. "I haven't danced in a long time," she replied, her voice soft, laced with something I couldn't quite decipher. "Regret? Nostalgia?" "A shame," Marcus said simply, not looking up from his work. "Some things are too beautiful to be kept in the past." That comment was a key turning a lock. After that, she began to talk, and he began to listen. Their conversations over the wall grew longer, becoming a daily ritual. She told him about the grueling discipline of ballet, the smell of rosin and sweat, the feeling of flight under the hot stage lights. He told her about the book he was writing, a novel about a man who leaves the city to rebuild a life from scratch. They were, I realized, telling each other the stories of their own lives, but disguised as fiction and memory. They discovered a shared sense of displacement, a mutual feeling of being outsiders in this pristine, orderly world. He was an artist who worked with his hands, a man of quiet thoughts in a neighborhood of loud ambition. She was a caged bird with clipped wings, a woman of passionate expression, living a life of muted composure. They were two lonely islands, and they were slowly, tentatively, building a bridge of words across the water that separated them. The change in Amelia was undeniable. A light had begun to return to her eyes, a spark that I had only ever seen in old photographs from her dancing days. And then one day, I saw her laugh. It was the moment that my vague unease curdled into real, solid fear. Marcus had told a story, something about a misadventure with a stubborn raccoon, and she had laughed. It wasn't the polite, tinkling laugh she reserved for my father's dinner parties. It was a full, throaty, uninhibited sound of pure joy. She threw her head back, the sun catching in her blonde hair, and for a few perfect seconds, she was completely unguarded, completely happy. The sound was so foreign and so wonderful that it was like hearing a beautiful, forgotten song, and it broke my heart, because I knew with absolute certainty that my father had never made her laugh like that. He provided her with a beautiful home, with security, with respectability. But this man, this stranger with stone dust on his jeans, had given her something my father couldn't or wouldn't, the simple, priceless gift of his undivided attention. He made her feel seen. I backed away from the window, the sound of her laughter still echoing in my ears. I was happy for her, a desperate, aching kind of happy, but I was also terrified. The whispers over the fence were no longer just whispers. They were the sound of a secret world being built, a world that did not include my father, a world that I was on the outside of, looking in. And I felt a chilling premonition that the beautiful bridge they were building was destined to lead them somewhere dangerous, somewhere from which there would be no return. It was their 7th anniversary. I knew because a ridiculously large bouquet of white orchids had been delivered that morning, the card signed with my father's looping, impersonal script. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a box ticked on his executive to-do list. But for Amelia, it seemed to be a promise. A current of hopeful energy ran through the house all day, a stark contrast to the usual languid quiet. She hummed to herself as she moved through the rooms, a soft, tuneless melody. She had spent the afternoon preparing a meal that was clearly meant to be a masterpiece, the kitchen filling with the rich scents of roasting duck and rosemary. Hope, I realized, was the most dangerous scent of all. Around 6, she disappeared upstairs. When she came down an hour later, the transformation was breathtaking. She wore a slip dress of deep sapphire silk, a color that turned her eyes to chips of the evening sky. It was a dress I had never seen before, simple but devastatingly elegant, clinging to her slender frame in a way that was both sophisticated and profoundly sensual. Her platinum hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and she wore a string of delicate pearls my father had given her years ago. She was not just a beautiful woman, she was a vision, a perfect, gleaming jewel set against the backdrop of our silent, polished home. She was a woman waiting for her husband to come home and truly see her. She lit the candles on the dining room table, their flames dancing in her hopeful eyes. She poured 2 glasses of champagne, the tiny bubbles rising in a frantic, celebratory fizz. And then she waited. 7 o'clock came and went. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed the half-hour with a mournful, heavy gong. I sat in the living room, the words of my book blurring into meaningless shapes, my own anxiety, a tight coil in my gut. I watched her maintain her posture on the edge of the dining room chair, a portrait of patient grace, but I could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the way her fingers kept tracing the rim of her champagne flute, leaving faint, nervous smudges on the crystal. With every passing minute, the expensive, elaborate meal cooled, and the hopeful energy in the room began to curdle into a familiar, bitter disappointment. The silence grew heavier, thick with everything that was not being said, with the promises that were not being kept. When the phone finally rang, it was almost a relief. Amelia snatched it from its cradle, her voice a bright, brittle David. The light in her face, however, lasted only a second. I watched the hope drain from her features as if a plug had been pulled. Her shoulders slumped. Her free hand came up to clutch at the pearls around her neck. The vibrant, living sculpture of a woman from an hour ago began to recede, replaced by the pale, fragile statue I knew so well. Her responses were clipped, hollow echoes in the cavernous room. "Yes," she said. "No, of course." A long pause. "Yes, I understand. It's important." And then the final, quiet words of surrender, the ones I had heard in different variations 100 times before. "It's fine. Don't worry about it. We'll celebrate another time." She placed the receiver back with a quiet, deliberate click and stood perfectly still. The candles flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, mocking the stillness of the scene. She looked at the perfect table, at the 2 full glasses of champagne, at the orchids gleaming spectrally in the dim light, and her expression was one of absolute desolation. She didn't cry. She simply blew out the candles one by one, plunging the room into a gray, funereal twilight. She couldn't stay in the house. I watched her slide open the glass door to the patio and step out into the fading light, a shimmering blue ghost against the deep green of the lawn. She walked aimlessly for a moment before stopping near the edge of the property, her arms wrapped around herself as if to ward off a sudden chill, though the evening was warm and humid, and that's when he appeared. Marcus was in his own yard, watering a bed of late summer tomatoes. He must have seen her, a flash of sapphire silk where there should only be shadows. He put down his watering can and walked slowly toward the low stone wall. He didn't call out to her, didn't startle her. He simply approached, a quiet, solid presence. I couldn't hear what he said, not at first, but I saw the way he looked at her, not with pity, but with a profound, gentle understanding. He saw it all, the beautiful dress, the solitary figure, the ruin of a special occasion. His gaze was a balm, where my father's absence was a wound. Then, in a gesture of simple, devastating tenderness, he reached down to one of his rose bushes, a variety that produced blooms of the deepest, most velvety crimson. He carefully snipped off a single, perfect flower. He held it out to her over the wall. She looked at the rose, then at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out to take it. As her delicate, pale fingers closed around the stem, his larger, soil-stained hand briefly covered hers. It was not a lover's caress, not yet. It was a gesture of pure human connection, of solace being offered and accepted. A silent acknowledgement of her pain. In that one small, quiet moment, Marcus Thorne gave her more than my father had managed to give her all day. He gave her a moment where she was the only person in the world. Watching from the window, I felt the last bit of ground crumble beneath my feet. This was it. This was the drop that overflows the cup, the gentle push that sends a lifetime of loneliness tumbling over the edge. It was no longer a question of if, but of when. The rose in her hand was more than just a flower. It was a promise of a different kind of world, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that she was going to walk into it. My father left for a 10-day business trip to Singapore on a Monday. The moment his Blacktown car disappeared down the street, the house exhaled, its rigid, formal posture collapsing into a boneless state of quiet. But the relief was short-lived. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was cavernous. Without the low hum of his conference calls, without the weight of his presence in his study, the house felt like a vast, empty museum after closing hours. It was just Amelia and me, two solitary ghosts rattling around in a space designed for a life that wasn't being lived. The silence became an active, pressing force, amplifying every tiny sound, the ticking of the hall clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the frantic beating of my own heart. It was the kind of quiet that drives a person to seek out any noise, any distraction, to prove they still exist. Amelia was adrift. She wandered from room to room, picking up expensive objects, tracing their outlines with a fingertip, and putting them down again. Her usual routines in the garden and the kitchen seemed like hollow gestures, actions performed by rote memory. The loneliness that usually clung to her like a fine mist had now condensed into a heavy, suffocating fog. I knew the invitation had already been made. I'd overheard it the day before my father left, a casual offering from Marcus over the stone wall. "I hit a breakthrough with the novel," he'd said, his voice a low murmur. "If you ever suffer a bout of terminal boredom, I could use a first reader. Let me know what you think." It was a perfectly crafted line, an open door with no pressure to walk through it. It gave her all the power, all the agency. The choice was entirely hers. For 2 days, she resisted. But on the third night, I could feel the battle reach its climax. A nervous, electric energy radiated from her. After a dinner that neither of us really ate, she began to pace. She walked from the living room to the dining room and back, her silk blouse whispering with each turn. She was a moth, trapped indoors, fluttering frantically against invisible walls, drawn by a distant, dangerous light. I sat on the sofa, pretending to be engrossed in my book, but I felt every ounce of her indecision. I was the unwilling audience for her silent, agonizing debate. Around 9 o'clock, she went upstairs. I heard the soft click of her closet door opening and closing, then the faint sound of running water from her bathroom. When she came down again 20 minutes later, she had changed. She was no longer wearing the casual loungewear she'd had on at dinner. She had put on a pair of dark, well-fitting jeans and a simple, cream-colored cashmere sweater. It wasn't overtly seductive, but it was intentional. Her hair was brushed out, falling cleanly over her shoulders, and she had a touch of makeup on, just enough to hide the shadows of her restlessness. She looked beautiful, but it was a nervous, fragile kind of beauty, like a priceless vase on the edge of a table. She picked up her phone, stared at the blank screen, and put it down. She walked to the window and looked out at the square of warm light in Marcus's house. She was making a pilgrimage in her mind before her feet ever moved. Finally, she turned to me, her face a carefully composed mask of casualness. "I think I'll go for a walk," she said, her voice a little too high, a little too bright. The air is so stuffy in here. The lie was a thin, transparent thing, hanging in the air between us. She wasn't going for a walk. We both knew there was only one destination on her mind. I didn't challenge her. I couldn't. What would I say? I felt 100 years old in that moment, a weary guardian of a secret I had no right to. I just nodded, my throat suddenly tight. "Okay," I said. The word was a whisper of consent, of complicity. It was all she needed. I watched her slide on a pair of sandals, her movements quick and decisive now that the choice was made. She opened the back door and slipped out into the night. I went to the living room window, my heart hammering against my ribs, and watched her solitary figure cross the perfectly manicured lawn. The 50 feet of grass separating our patio from his felt like a vast, treacherous ocean she was determined to cross. She walked with her head down, a woman on a mission, a sleepwalker drawn toward a dream. She didn't hesitate when she reached his door. She simply raised a hand and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, spilling a warm, golden light onto the dark stone of his porch. Marcus stood there, and even from a distance, I could see the quiet welcome in his posture. He wasn't surprised. He had been waiting. He stepped aside to let her in, and for a moment, I saw past them into his world. It was nothing like ours. Where our home was a symphony of cool, minimalist whites and grays, his was a chaotic, warm jumble of color and texture. Books overflowed from shelves, stacked on the floor, resting on every available surface. A worn, comfortable-looking leather sofa faced a fireplace, a soft wool blanket tossed over its arm. The air itself seemed different, alive, a place where thoughts were had and passions were felt, not suppressed. It was the home of a man who truly lived in his space, and as Amelia stepped over the threshold, she looked like a weary traveler finally reaching a long-sought-after sanctuary. Then he closed the door. The square of warm light vanished, and the world outside was plunged back into darkness. And I was left on the other side of the glass, in the cold, perfect house, utterly alone with the terrible, thrilling certainty of what was about to happen. The dance of temptation was over, and a far more dangerous performance had just begun. Looking back, I see now that her late-night walk across the lawn was not the beginning, but the culmination. The true beginning, the moment the current of unspoken desire finally broke its banks, happened 2 days earlier, during the storm. The afternoon had been suffocating, the air thick and yellow, charged with an oppressive humidity that promised violence. The sky was a bruised purple-gray, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. Amelia was in the garden, as she so often was, attacking the weeds around her rose bushes with a frantic energy, as if she could pull her own restlessness out of the earth by its roots. I watched her from the kitchen window, a damp cloth in my hand, too lethargic from the heat to do anything but observe the slow, graceful movements of her body under the threatening sky. She was a study in contrasts, her elegant, pale form against the dark, churning clouds. The storm broke without warning. A sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the trees, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to split the sky in two. Then the rain came, not in drops, but in a solid, blinding sheet of water that instantly turned the lawn into a swamp and blurred the world outside the window into an impressionist painting. Amelia was caught in the deluge, far from the house. She let out a small cry and began to run, her thin white blouse instantly soaked and clinging to her skin. She wasn't running for our patio. She was much closer to his. Marcus was already on his covered porch, leaning against a post, watching the storm as if it were an old friend. He saw her, of course. He called out something I couldn't hear over the roar of the rain and gestured for her to join him. She didn't hesitate, darting up the steps of his porch, shaking water from her hair like a half-drowned nymph. They were trapped there together, two figures in a small, dry bubble, while the world dissolved in a fury of wind and water around them. The porch became an intimate island, isolated from everything else. I moved to the living room window, which offered a clearer, if more distant view. I watched them talk. The sound of the storm was too loud to hear their words, but I didn't need to. I could read the story in their bodies. They stood close, leaning against the railing, their shoulders almost touching. At first, they seemed to be talking about the storm itself, gesturing at the lightning that split the sky. But then the conversation deepened. I saw Marcus's posture soften, his gaze on her becoming more intent. I saw Amelia's hands move as she spoke, not with nervous energy, but with the fluid grace of a storyteller. Later, I would come to believe this was when they exchanged their truths. This was when he told her about the wife who had left him because she couldn't stand the quiet life of a writer. And this was when she told him about the ghost of a ballerina that still haunted her dreams. The life of passion she had traded for a life of comfort. They were showing each other their scars, their secret, aching voids. The rain began to lessen its assault, but they didn't seem to notice. He said something that made her look away, a curtain of damp blonde hair falling across her face. A single drop of rain, or perhaps a tear, traced a path down her cheek. And then he moved. He reached out, his gestures slow and deliberate, and with the tips of his fingers, he gently brushed the moisture from her skin. It was the quietest, most tender touch, but it was an earthquake. The air between them crackled. The last pretense of a neighborly chat dissolved, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of their connection. She looked up at him, her lips parted slightly, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and longing. He lowered his head, and in the gray, storm-washed light, he kissed her. It was not a frantic, desperate kiss. It was slow, hesitant at first, a question being asked and answered in the same moment. It was a kiss of profound recognition, of two lonely souls finding a sudden, unexpected harbor. I watched, my own breath catching in my throat, as her hands came up to rest on his chest, her fingers curling into the damp fabric of his shirt. I saw his hand move to cup the back of her neck, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, and what had begun as tender discovery quickly flared into a desperate, hungry passion, a release of all the longing and unspoken words that had simmered between them for weeks. It was a kiss that contained the entire summer, the heat, the loneliness, the whispers over the fence, the silent acknowledgement of a shared ache. From my vantage point, they were just two silhouettes, a man and a woman lost in an embrace while the storm raged around them. But to me, they were the storm itself. The rain began to slow to a steady, quiet drizzle. The thunder retreated, rumbling its discontent in the distance. The spell was broken. They pulled apart slowly, a new, shy awkwardness between them. The air was no longer charged with unspoken tension, but with the heavy, irreversible reality of what they had done. Amelia said something, her hand flying to her lips as if to hold the kiss in. Then, without another look, she turned and hurried down the steps, running across the wet grass back to the sterile safety of our house, leaving him alone on the porch, watching her go. I backed away from the window, my own face feeling cold and damp. The innocent image of my stepmother was gone forever, replaced by the searing memory of her face, tilted up to receive a stranger's kiss. The whispers had been given a voice, the longing had been given a form, and I knew, with a sick, sinking certainty, that this single kiss in the rain was not an ending, but the beginning of a deluge that would eventually sweep us all away. The kiss in the storm had broken something inside Amelia. The carefully constructed dam of duty and propriety that had held back years of loneliness was fractured, and now, desire was seeping through the cracks, unstoppable. The 2 days that followed were a torment for both of us. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was filled with her restlessness. I would watch her drift through rooms, her hand rising to touch her lips, a faraway look in her eyes. The house had become a cage, and she was pacing its gilded bars, her spirit already flown over the stone wall next door. The internal battle was over. All that was left was the final, unconditional surrender. It came on the third night of my father's absence. The moon was a sharp, silver sliver in a black sky, and the heat of the day had not yet broken. I was in my room, the light off, trying to read by the glow of my bedside lamp, but my mind was not on the page. I was listening. I could hear the floorboards creaking downstairs as she moved back and forth, a metronome marking the final seconds of her old life. Finally, the pacing stopped. I heard her soft footsteps on the stairs. I held my breath as she paused outside my open door. I didn't look up from my book, but I could feel her presence, her hesitation. "Leo?" she whispered. I lowered my book. "I can't sleep," she said, her voice thin and strained. "I'm just going to sit outside for a while." It was the same lie as before, but tonight it was stripped of all pretense. It was a confession. We both knew she was not going to sit on the patio. We both knew where she was going. My throat was thick with unspoken accusations, with pleas for her to stop, to turn back, but I said nothing. I was a coward, paralyzed by a confused mix of pity and disgust. I simply nodded into the shadows. Her quiet goodnight was the sound of a final goodbye to the woman she used to be. I listened to her footsteps descend the stairs, the soft click of the patio door sliding open, and then a profound and terrible silence. He opened the door before she knocked, as if he had been standing there waiting, sensing her approach. He didn't speak. He simply took her hand, his warm, strong fingers lacing through her cool, trembling ones, and led her inside. He led her past the living room filled with books and up the creaking wooden stairs to his bedroom. The room was simple, dominated by a large, unadorned oak bed and bathed in the soft, intimate glow of a single lamp. The windows were open, and the sound of the cicadas drifted in, a pulsating soundtrack for the sin they were about to commit. She stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, a last, futile gesture of self-preservation. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We can't. This is wrong." He came to stand in front of her, his hands gently prying her arms apart. He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze steady and serious. "No," he said, his voice a low, soothing murmur. "Being lonely is wrong. Being invisible is wrong. This," he said, raising a hand to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin, "is the only thing that has felt right all summer." He kissed her then, a deep, searching kiss that tasted of patience and understanding. It broke the last of her resistance. When they parted, he began to undress her, his movements unhurried and reverent. He unbuttoned her silk blouse, his knuckles brushing against her skin, sending shivers through her. As he pushed the fabric from her shoulders, he paused, his eyes tracing the delicate line of her collarbone. "A dancer's bones," he whispered, as if to himself. She wore delicate, ivory-colored lace lingerie underneath, the kind of beautiful, secret thing a woman wears for herself. My father had likely never seen it. Marcus's eyes drank in the sight of her, the swell of her full, pale breasts above the lace, the gentle curve of her hips. He didn't look at her with raw lust, but with an artist's appreciation, a connoisseur's wonder. "You are so beautiful, Amelia," he breathed, and she let out a small, choked sob. It was the sound of a parched woman finally being offered water. She was trembling as he guided her to the bed, her mind a whirlwind of guilt and a desire so powerful it obliterated everything else. As his hands and mouth began their slow, deliberate exploration of her body, her token protests melted away, replaced by sounds she hadn't made in years, perhaps ever. Her initial, fearful whispers of Marcus, "Please, we shouldn't," were soon lost, swallowed by breathy gasps, as his touch ignited nerve endings long dormant. His name became a mantra, a prayer sighed against the skin of his shoulder. The years of quiet frustration, of feeling unseen and untouched, unraveled in a series of shuddering waves. It was a reclaiming of the body she felt she had lost, the passionate, responsive body of the artist she once was. Her quiet, hesitant moans blossomed into the unrestrained cries of a woman not just feeling pleasure, but feeling alive. And as he finally moved inside her, she met his rhythm with a desperate, frantic energy, a surrender so total, so absolute, that it was a kind of salvation. All the while, I sat in my darkened room, a prisoner of my own imagination. I stared at the single-lit window in the house next door, a malevolent yellow eye in the darkness. It was the only evidence of the treason being committed, and it burned itself onto the back of my eyelids. I couldn't see anything, but I could picture it all. My mind, a cruel and inventive torturer, supplied the details, the tangle of limbs on the sheets, the scent of their mingled sweat, the sound of her voice, calling his name. Every minute that passed was an agony. I listened for the sound of her return, straining my ears against the incessant screaming of the cicadas. The night stretched into an eternity. Finally, hours later, the yellow eye in the window blinked out. Sometime after that, I heard the whisper-soft slide of our patio door. I saw a shadow flit past my door in the hallway. She was back. The act was done. She had crossed the lawn and returned a different woman, and the house she returned to was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, and we were both drenched in the evidence of her sin. That first night created a fault line, splitting our summer into a before and an after. Before, there was a quiet, predictable loneliness. After, the house was filled with the vibrant, terrifying hum of a secret life. For the remainder of the week that my father was in Singapore, the affair was a fever dream. Amelia was a different woman, shedding her skin of quiet melancholy to reveal someone I had never met, a woman who was radiant, alive, and utterly reckless. She would invent reasons to be outside, her conversations over the stone wall now punctuated by daring, lingering touches. She would disappear for an hour in the middle of the afternoon, returning with her hair slightly mussed and a high, flushed color in her cheeks, the scent of his cologne clinging faintly to her clothes. She was luminous, lit from within by a dangerous, exhilarating energy, and her happiness was so potent it was almost painful to witness. I was her keeper, her silent, unwilling alibi. I became an expert at reading the subtle cues, at knowing when to make myself scarce, when to retreat to my room with my headphones on to block out the sounds of a life that was not my own. I came home early one afternoon from the library and nearly stumbled right into their secret world. I walked in through the back door, and the sound of his low voice, so alien within the walls of our home, stopped me cold in the hallway. They were on the patio, sitting at the small wrought iron table, a pot of tea between them. They weren't touching, but the space between them was electric, intimate. He was leaning forward, speaking earnestly, and she was looking at him with an expression of such rapt, unguarded adoration that it felt like I was looking directly into the sun. Her laughter, when it came, was the soft, genuine sound I had heard once before, but now it was familiar, practiced. I saw him reach across the table and place his hand over hers. A simple gesture, possessive and tender. At that moment, I must have made a sound, a scuff of a shoe on the tile, because Amelia's head snapped up. Her eyes met mine through the glass of the kitchen door. The radiant joy on her face vanished in an instant, replaced by a stark, animal panic. Her hand flew back from his as if burned. The transformation was horrifying. She was a queen one moment, and a guilty, terrified child the next. Marcus stood up slowly, gave me a calm, unreadable nod, and then retreated back across the lawn to his own territory, leaving Amelia and me alone in the wreckage of the stolen moment. We didn't speak of it. We never did. The silence was our pact. When my father returned, the atmosphere in the house shifted from a fever dream to a high-wire act. The secret had to be buried deeper, hidden beneath layers of practiced normalcy. Amelia, the radiant lover, disappeared, and Amelia, the perfect wife, took her place. But it was a strained, brittle performance. The light in her was still there, but it was banked, hidden, and the effort of concealing it made her jumpy and anxious. She would startle if my father entered a room unexpectedly. Her phone, once left casually on a counter, was now guarded like a state secret. She began dressing with more care, even on days spent at home, choosing elegant blouses instead of simple t-shirts, wearing a touch of lipstick even to make breakfast. To my father, it probably looked like she was making an effort for him, a sign of a happy wife. To me, it was the armor of her new identity, the costume for her double life. The family dinners became almost unbearable, a masterclass in tension and deceit. The three of us would sit at the long mahogany table, and David would recount his day, oblivious. "Saw your friend next door, Amelia," he said one evening, spearing a piece of asparagus. "Thorn. Seems like a decent fellow. Said he appreciated you lending him those shears." I watched Amelia's hand tighten around her wine glass, her knuckles turning white, but her smile never wavered. "Yes, he's very pleasant," she said, her voice perfectly even. "He's a writer." Her eyes, for a fraction of a second, flickered toward the dark windows that faced his house. The betrayal was so audacious, so breathtakingly close to the surface, that I felt a wave of nausea. I was an accessory to the crime, forced to sit and break bread with the victim, knowing the assassin was sitting right beside him, smiling. I was torn in two. A part of me, the part that had watched her sad, lonely waltz for years, was fiercely protective of her newfound life. I saw her humming in the kitchen. I saw the way she looked at her own reflection with a flicker of renewed confidence, and I felt a pang of joy for her. She was no longer a ghost in her own home. But the other part of me, the son, felt sick with guilt. I couldn't look my father in the eye. His cheerful ignorance, his trust, felt like a physical weight on my own shoulders. The secret was not mine, but I was its prisoner. It isolated me, building a wall of glass between me and my own family. My relationship with Amelia became a strange, silent negotiation, a constant dance around the massive truth in the middle of the room. We would pass in the hallway, and for a moment our eyes would meet, and in that shared glance was a world of knowledge, accusation, and shared conspiracy. The summer was no longer measured in weeks or days, but in the agonizingly slow moments between close calls, in the stretched-out seconds of a tense dinner, in the heavy, suffocating silence of a house built on a foundation of beautiful, treacherous lies. The secret had a weight, a physical presence that had settled over our house, making the air thick and hard to breathe. It stole my sleep, leaving me to toss and turn in the suffocating August heat, the shrill, incessant cry of the cicadas, a perfect echo of the screaming in my own mind. I had grown accustomed to the mechanics of the affair, to the stolen glances and the flimsy excuses. I had learned to live with the knowledge, but to live with something is not the same as to accept it. A part of me was always on watch, a nervous sentinel at the edge of a simmering war. And on that particular night, the unease was a sharp physical thing, a sickness in the pit of my stomach. My father was home, asleep down the hall, a thought that made the air even more dangerously charged. I knew, with a primal, gut-deep certainty, that something was wrong. It was a fool's errand, I told myself, as I slid out of my sweat-soaked sheets. Don't look. But my feet carried me to the window anyway, my body a traitor to my own peace of mind, drawn by a morbid, irresistible gravity. And there it was, the single, accusing square of light in his upstairs bedroom window. At first, I saw nothing, and a wave of foolish relief washed over me. But I kept watching, my eyes straining against the darkness, and then I saw them. Silhouettes against a drawn shade, a pantomime of shadows. It was them. And this was not the tender, hesitant exploration of their first time. This was something else entirely. This was a frenzy, a desperate, hungry collision. The careful dance had become a frantic exorcism of loneliness. I saw his shadow lift her legs wrapping around his waist, her body clinging to his like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. They moved with a raw, powerful rhythm, a single, two-backed creature born of pure, unrestrained need. My hand came up to brace myself against the window frame, the wood cool against my feverish skin. The glass felt like a portal to a hell that was designed just for me. My mind, a cruel and inventive collaborator, filled in the details my eyes were denied. It supplied the soundtrack to their silent, shadowy performance. I could almost hear the sound of their skin slapping together, the groan of the bed springs. I could imagine the scent of their bodies, of sweat and sex, and her jasmine perfume. In my head, I heard her voice, not the polite, measured tones of my stepmother, but the guttural, broken cries of a woman utterly consumed. My traitorous imagination whispered the words I knew she must be saying, her voice a ragged plea against his neck. "Marcus, please, harder." I squeezed my eyes shut, but the image was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. I saw her hands, not as shadows, but in perfect detail, her fingers digging into the muscles of his back, her knuckles white. I pictured her face, twisted in an expression of such intense, agonizing pleasure that it was indistinguishable from pain. "Oh God, right there! Don't stop! Don't you ever stop!" I felt a wave of dizziness, my own breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I was no longer just a witness. I was a participant, a voyeur tied to the scene by an invisible thread of shame and fascination. I forced my eyes open again, just in time for the final, devastating climax. I saw her body arch back, a taut, quivering bowstring pulled to its absolute limit. Her head fell back, her throat exposed to the dim lamplight, her hair a wild, pale halo. It was a moment of pure, animalistic release, a posture of total and complete surrender. And then it happened. Her eyes, which had been squeezed shut in ecstasy, slowly fluttered open. For a second, they were unfocused, glazed over, seeing nothing but the landscape of her own pleasure. Her gaze drifted aimlessly around the room, then floated towards the window, towards the deep, velvety darkness of the world outside. And then her eyes found my window. It took a moment for them to focus, for her passion-dazed mind to process what she was seeing, a darker shadow in the shadows, the unmistakable silhouette of a person, watching, and her gaze locked with mine. The universe stopped, the cicadas fell silent, my heart stopped beating. I saw the precise moment that her reality fractured. The look of transcendent pleasure on her face didn't just fade, it shattered, instantly, violently. It was replaced by a wave of expressions so rapid it was like watching a film in fast forward. Confusion, then dawning awareness, then a look of such profound, soul-flaying horror that it will be seared into my memory until the day I die. The pleasure was gone, replaced by the naked, ugly truth of her shame, her betrayal, her deceit, all of it reflected back at her in the horrified eyes of her husband's son. She was a moth, and she had not only flown into the flame, but had looked up in her final, burning moment to see that the fire itself had a face, and it was mine. I stumbled back from the window, my legs giving way. I collapsed onto the floor, choking on a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The connection was broken, but the damage was absolute. I was no longer the keeper of her secret. I was a part of it, stained by it, and the image of her face, caught in that terrible, silent scream between ecstasy and damnation, was a wound from which I knew I would never, ever recover. Sleep did not come. It was a mercy I was denied. I spent the rest of the night on the floor of my room, my back pressed against the wall, staring at the innocent, mocking rectangle of the window. The images played in my head on a continuous, brutal loop. The tangle of their shadowed limbs, the arch of her back, and then her face, her horrified eyes locking with mine in that single, eternal second of shared damnation. When the first pale, gray light of dawn began to seep into the room, it felt like an intrusion, an unwanted visitor in my private tomb of trauma. The cheerful chirping of the morning birds sounded like shards of glass against my raw nerves. A new day had begun, but my world had ended. Every mundane detail of the morning was now alien, grotesque. The scent of coffee brewing downstairs, a smell that had always meant comfort and home, now seemed sinister, a prelude to a new kind of torment. Eventually, I forced myself to move, my limbs stiff and cold. Walking down the stairs felt like descending into a deep, dark body of water, the pressure building with every step. I didn't know what I would do, what I would say. I had no plan. I was operating on a kind of numb, shell-shocked autopilot. I found her in the kitchen. She had her back to me, standing at the counter, attempting to perform the simple, familiar ritual of making coffee, but her body was rigid with a tension that was painful to see. She was a ghost of the vibrant, luminous woman who had existed for a few brief, secret weeks. Her skin was a pale, clammy gray, and the dark circles under her eyes were like bruises. Her hands trembled so violently that she spilled a cascade of dark coffee grounds across the white marble counter. The small, messy accident seemed to shatter what was left of her composure. She let out a tiny, strangled gasp and just stood there, staring at the mess, her shoulders shaking. She knew I was there, but she couldn't turn, couldn't face me. I was the source of the horror, the living embodiment of her exposure. The silence was a physical entity, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered all sound. I said nothing. I walked past her to the refrigerator, my movements feeling unnaturally loud in the dead air. The click of the refrigerator door, the glug of water pouring into a glass, each sound was an accusation. I drank the water, my eyes fixed on the back of her head, on her hunched, defeated posture. All the pity I had once felt for her loneliness had been burned away, cauterized by the white-hot shame of what I had seen. In its place was a cold, hard stone of anger and violation. She had not just betrayed my father, She had dragged me into the filth of her secret, making me an unwilling participant in her sin. The torture was amplified 100-fold when my father came down, breezy and oblivious, dressed for a Saturday of golf. "Morning, you two," he said cheerfully, kissing the top of Amelia's head. She flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but I saw it. "Smells good in here." He was a man walking through a minefield, completely unaware of the danger beneath his feet. Amelia turned then, and the smile she pasted on her face was a ghastly, terrifying thing, a rictus of sheer panic. "Good morning, dear," she managed to say, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. "Did you sleep well?" The irony was so profound it was almost comical. My father, busy reading the headlines on his phone, didn't notice a thing. He complained about his handicap, discussed the weather, mapped out his day, all while his wife and son sat across the table from him in their own private, silent hell. I didn't eat. I couldn't. I just stared at my plate, my silence, a roaring, deafening accusation that only one other person at the table could hear. After my father left, whistling, the silence crashed back down, heavier and more menacing than before. We were alone again, the accused and her witness. I stood up to take my plate to the sink, desperate to escape. That's when she finally broke. "Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking. I stopped but didn't turn around. I could feel her get up, could hear her hesitant footsteps on the tile behind me. "Leo, please." I turned slowly to face her. Her face was a ruin of desperation and shame, her eyes pleading. This was it. The moment of confrontation, of explanation, of excuses I couldn't bear to hear. "About last night," she began, her hand reaching out as if to touch my arm. I can explain. I didn't let her finish. I didn't shout. I didn't accuse her. I did something far crueler. I simply looked at her, my face a cold, blank mask, and I turned and walked out of the room. Her unfinished sentence hung in the air, dissolving into the crushing silence. My silent departure was a verdict, a judgment more brutal and absolute than any angry words could ever be. It told her she was beneath explanation, that her reasons didn't matter. It told her that I was no longer the boy she knew, but a stranger who had seen the ugliest part of her soul. I walked out the front door and into the bright, indifferent morning, gasping for air that wasn't contaminated with their secrets. The power had shifted. I held her ruin in the palm of my hand, and I had just learned that the most devastating weapon in the world wasn't a shout, but a profound and unforgiving silence. The last 2 weeks of that summer were lived in a state of suspended animation. We existed in a thick, gelatinous silence, moving through the motions of our lives with the slow, unnatural grace of astronauts in zero gravity. My father's cheerful, oblivious presence was the axis around which our silent, spinning torment revolved. He would talk about golf scores and stock market fluctuations, while Amelia and I sat at opposite ends of the dinner table, two prisoners communicating in the coded language of averted eyes and unfinished sentences. She was a wraith, a pale imitation of the woman she had been. The vibrant, secret life that had illuminated her from within was extinguished, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of fear. She moved through the house soundlessly, her every action a performance of contrition, her every glance a plea for a verdict I refused to deliver. The power I held over her was a toxic, heavy thing, a crown of thorns I had never asked to wear. My perception of my father had warped, twisted into something unrecognizable. The man I had once seen as a pillar of strength, a remote but solid foundation for my world, now seemed like a fool. I would look at him, laughing at a joke on television or reading the paper, and a wave of contempt and pity would wash over me. His blindness was not a sign of trust. It was a symptom of his profound, self-absorbed neglect. He had given his wife a beautiful cage, and he couldn't even be bothered to notice when she had flown straight into the bars, desperate for any kind of escape. He was not a victim in a simple sense. He was a co-architect of his own betrayal, and my anger at Amelia was now complicated by a simmering resentment for him. The two of them had created this tragedy, and I was the one left to carry its corpse. My departure for college became a singular point of focus, a light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. Packing my bags was a desperate, feverish act. I wasn't just folding clothes and stacking books. I was trying to contain the summer, to wrestle its ugly, sprawling ghost into a suitcase and lock it shut. I wanted to escape the house, which no longer felt like a home but a mausoleum, a tomb for a family that had died without a funeral. I wanted to outrun the memory of her face in the window, a memory that ambushed me in quiet moments, leaving me breathless and shaking. I wanted, more than anything, to be the boy I was in May, a boy who believed in the simple, solid architecture of his own life. On the morning I was set to leave, after I had loaded the last box into my car, she was waiting for me in the foyer. It was the first time she had deliberately put herself in my path since that terrible morning in the kitchen. She didn't try to speak. Words were useless between us now. She simply stood there, her hands twisting nervously in front of her, and held out a small, flat box wrapped in plain brown paper. Her eyes, for the first time, met mine directly, and they were stripped of all artifice. In their depths, I saw everything: the crushing weight of her guilt, the terror of her situation, and a desperate, hopeless plea for an absolution I could not give. My hand trembled slightly as I took the box from her. It was light, almost weightless. Our fingers brushed for a fraction of a second, and her skin was as cold as a stone. That was our goodbye. I didn't open it until I was a mile down the road, pulled over on the shoulder, the engine idling. My hands felt clumsy as I tore away the paper. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a moth. It was a Luna moth. Its vast, wing-like tails, a pale, ethereal green. Its body, a ghostly white. It was exquisitely beautiful and exquisitely dead. A perfect specimen pinned through the thorax. Its brief, frantic flight forever ended. It was from him, I knew. A message passed through her. The sound of a moth. A creature of the night, drawn irresistibly to a destructive light. It was an artist's apology, a poet's confession, a final, beautiful, and cruel acknowledgement of the damage they had done. She was the moth, and he was the flame, and this dead, beautiful thing was all that was left of their collision. I started the car and pulled back onto the highway, the box resting on the passenger seat beside me. I didn't know if I would ever tell my father. The choice felt strangely irrelevant now. Telling him would be a detonation, but the bomb had already gone off, silently, weeks ago. We were all just living in the fallout, breathing in the poison. The truth wouldn't fix what was broken. It would only give it a name. As our town receded in my rearview mirror, I knew I was not escaping. I was just carrying the wreckage to a different location. The summer had murdered my innocence, leaving a weary, cynical old man in the body of a 19-year-old boy. It had taught me that love and betrayal are not opposites, but twisted, intimate neighbors, and that silence can be the most violent sound of all. And I knew, with a certainty that felt like a sentence, that for the rest of my life, no matter how far I ran, I would be haunted by the ghost of a moth and by the memory of my stepmother's face, trapped forever in a window between a moment of impossible pleasure and one of absolute, soul-destroying horror.